Hello and welcome to SRI Executives in Conversation series. My name is Noel Keogh and I am head of the Development Finance Practice Group here at SRI Executive. Today we are joined by our guest Hong Paterson. She is the Chief Finance Officer and Chief Operating Officer with the Green Climate Fund. And the topic we are discussing is one that is also close to my own heart, that of cross-sector career moves. More specifically, the insights and experiences of those individuals that have made that move, Hong being one of them. But before we jump into the topic, Hong, you might like to introduce yourself first.
Hi, Noel, and thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to SRI. So I'm Hong Paterson. I am currently the CFO and COO of the Green Climate Fund. I've been with the fund for 3.5 years, nearly 4 years now. Prior to this, similar to your background, I spent all of my time in the private sector, just over 20 plus years in financial services, based out originally in the US, then into Europe and the UK, eventually making my way over to Asia before finally moving over to the GCF.
Brilliant. So I suppose, look, why are we here today, and what are we talking about? What is the topic? Well, the topic, I suppose, is switching careers and switching sectors. Well, it's something that we, as in SRI, are being requested more and more by our clients from the outset of the search, and something we ourselves see as important to a successful search. And that is to look beyond to the traditional hunting grounds, the traditional skill sets, traditional networks and so forth that exist within the development sector, but to also focus on the private sector, and in particular, those individuals within the private sector that are maybe ready to make the move to mission-driven organizations that possess transferable skills, that maybe bring new ways of working, new ways of thinking, that can maybe open doors to new funding opportunities, new markets, and so forth. There is an understanding now that by bringing on board talent from different sectors beyond the development sector, that you can bring a real synergy and ultimately make the organization stronger, leaner, and more dynamic. I myself, as you mentioned, Hong, made that move as well, from financial services to international NGOs some 12 years ago, and I've never looked back. For me, it was the pull factor of wanting to give back, make a difference, make a change the world, I suppose, in my naivety. But having travelled throughout Africa, South America, Asia, Middle East, it really opened my eyes to what life was like for the vast majority of people that we share this planet with. And now I haven't changed the world, but I have not regretted the move at all. And I love playing a part, albeit a small part, in my current role. Now helping mission-driven organizations identify leaders who are far better placed than me to bring about that change in the world. People like yourself, Hong. So I suppose if we can turn to you, Hong. What made you decide to shift your career from the private sector to the development sector, particularly the climate sector? Because I understand it was SRI that reached out to you in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And thanks for sharing your story. I hadn't realized that. So I guess my story is probably a little bit similar to you. And I think that, when I think about my career, really is age and stage. I think when you're first starting out, I'm so impressed by this generation. I should start with that. I am so impressed with the younger generation coming out, and more of them having a sense of what they want to do from a social impact perspective. And when I think about my generation and when I first started, it really was about making money, and can you pay the rent, can you pay the bills, and that really was what was the driving force in terms of thinking about what I was going to do. And at the time, banking was the most profitable business you could get into, and so but as that career goes along, at least for me, my priorities started shifting in terms of what I wanted to do and what was important for me. And that also was prompted a lot from having a daughter, and raising a family and thinking about what my daughter was going to be inheriting beyond just, the obvious financials, but in terms of the world. So my journey in looking for a mission-based career actually started probably about 7 to 10 years before even SRI approached me. And so it was a really, really great timing when they approached me. And I guess, when I think about the driver for me, a big chunk of it really came through from when I had my daughter and thinking about the future that she was going to be living in. And that was really important for me. But I think having grown up as a refugee, so I'm originally Vietnamese, and we were refugees to the US, that desire to do something more, to think about, beyond, the immediate of making money, the immediate of just, the quality of my life, but thinking about, my past, my ability to succeed, and the infrastructure that was available to me because of, UN agencies, because of government support, and, what could I give back? And so that was really the personal drive for me.
Right.
But it was very fortuitous that SRI approached me at the time that they did, or the time that you did. And it really was, my daughter was at university, and at this point, I'm really only needing to think about myself, and this is a really good opportunity to then make that transition.
Right. Well, I never realized, Hong, that like you have an incredible backstory there as well, and it's an interesting one. Like you speak about being, coming as a refugee from Vietnam, and it's something that's kind of close, I think, to our hearts. We had St. Patrick's Day there. We were talking about it before, just a week or so ago, and it kind of brings us back as well to where Irish people kind of came from, and we were once refugees too, albeit 150, 170 years ago, or whatever the case might be. But it is a story that you sticks with you, and it's kind of in the DNA maybe as such as well when you come from that. But that's an incredible backstory as well, Hong, and thanks for sharing it with us. In terms of other aspects, then, like you said, you were thinking about the transition. Anyway, you made the transition, I think, a few years before SRI reached out to you. Were there aspects of the private sector in your background that maybe gave you an advantage, do you think, in your current role? Do you feel it was something that is of benefit to you, or was of benefit to you when you made that switch?
So thank you for that. Yeah, yes. So it was not an easy transition. And I think that, going back to that whole age and stage, at some point I realized that I did want to take advantage of, the skills that I had developed. And I was actually thinking that I might need to take a step back in order to move forward with my career. And I think that that's something that even, I still keep in touch with my colleagues from the private sector and my friends, and some of them, as they think about moving towards more mission-based careers, they're also thinking, do I need to take a step back? And so I was just so fortunate that when SRI approached me for this position, that I was able to really move my career forward at the same time of pivoting that career towards a more mission-based career. Climate finance specifically is so nascent, and it still is. And I'm eyeball deep into it with the GCF. And so it doesn't feel that way oftentimes. But when I step back and I'm speaking to people who are not involved in it, it's really interesting how I've forgotten that so many, and particularly in the private sector, how novel it is for them to be thinking about this, and how risky they think it is. And so, there's real opportunities to leverage private sector knowledge, and particularly in terms of investments when it comes to climate financing. GCF is such a unique organization in the sense that I work with everyone from people from humanitarian backgrounds to scientists, and then as well as people with banking backgrounds. But climate financing can only come together with all of that combined. And so the decisions at the investment committees, when I was sitting in financial services, is really about that profit taking and the hurdles that you need to meet in order to have that project passed. Here, the discussion really is around impact. It's really around the adoption on the ground and what that could potentially mean to beneficiaries. And then we look at the financials. And so the skill sets that I think coming in from the private sector, I think it's still that knowledge in terms of complex structuring is still quite new within the development sector, the public sector. And so having that private sector background and understanding how investments are developed, how to think about it from a profitability perspective is akin to having to think about the scarce financial resources that climate financing has today. Mm-hmm. So as part of the Paris Agreement, it was $100 billion commitment per annum. The problem statement now, fast forward 10 years, is a few trillion dollars per annum in order to maintain climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius. When you then couple that with the GCF, which is the largest climate-focused fund now sitting at $33 billion in pledges, it's just a drop in the bucket. And so really a lot of the financial decisions are very similar to profit-taking kind of decisions. Am I going to decide on this project, or am I going to decide on that project with the valuable financial resources that you have? And so I think that the private sector discipline in looking at that has really helped me through this transition.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I can kind of relate to that one as well, because I found it quite a shock to the system, maybe moving from, that financial services, investment banking kind of space to now I went into the NGO sector, so it was slightly kind of different, but bringing that knowledge and experience was good. I went into a fundraising role, so it was quite a shift, but it enabled me to look at things differently, and I suppose that's something as well that you would have brought with you too. And what would you say were the biggest kind of like learning curves, I suppose, that you would have experienced when you first took up the role? Because as I said, I had the benefit of taking a year out and go back to college, which I think helped quite a lot. How about yourself? What were those learning curves?
Sure. And so before I get into the learning curves, I have to agree with you on the sales side. Oftentimes what I've experienced is on the public sector side, there really is a call to that altruism, wanting to talk about the impact, talking about, what are you doing? What social good are you doing? And having just gone through the replenishment, which is basically going to governments and donor countries seeking additional contributions into the fund, what has actually helped me coming from the private sector on the sales side is really understanding that this is all a sales pitch. Mm-hmm. And so approaching it in a more, I guess, impartial nature of things, of looking at it as a business transaction where a country can invest either in the GCF or they can invest, bilaterally for another country in terms of their climate action. The approach that I've now taken is very much of what I used to do in the private sector, which is what's in it for them? How do I sell GCF? And so it's a subtle but important differentiator, because oftentimes when when public sector come in, they always try and engage from the public good perspective and from an altruistic perspective, and that's not always the decision point that governments have. That said, one of the biggest learning curves that I've had is really understanding the complexity of public sector. I used to think that private sector was really complex. I mean, in terms of financial instruments, in terms of the different bodies, in terms of the decisioning points, the capital exposures, and the regulatory environment, particularly for financial services. I used to think that that was just so hugely complex, and absolutely I could navigate that, no problem. And that's how I came in thinking, absolutely, I can do this. I'm used to complexity. And when you get into the public sector, it is just so complex in terms of the stakeholders and what is the driving force behind each of the stakeholders. And in some instances, it's for country good. In other instances, it's for universal collaboration. In other instances, it's about climate impact specifically, or various other issues. And so the decision from getting from point A to point B in public sector tends to be a fairly straight line, because any deviation from that deviates or takes away from profit taking. Here, in the public sector, you really need to navigate the various stakeholders, make sure that they are on point and that they agree and that they understand the what's in it for them, as well as for me to understand what's in it for them, and that is oftentimes the most efficient way of getting from point A to point B. Is definitely not in a straight line, but across various angles, and it moves away from looking at it two-dimensionally into 3 dimensions. And so that has been the biggest learning curve for me, is really developing that political acumen, understanding that landscape, and having a lot more patience around that, and navigating that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because I suppose different ways of working maybe, and sometimes we kind of say it works at a different pace or something, but it's not necessarily always the case. It's the case that there's just different processes that we're not used to when you're coming from the private sector, and that all takes time to adjust to as well. And I suppose in your experiences then, what would you see as the benefits to organizations in hiring from the private sector? And I suppose you've kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of like the skill sets, and like bringing that sales experience is something that was really important. But what other things do you think are of benefit to organizations when looking at the private sector?
Yeah. So I guess, one of the things that I thought a lot about this outside of the technical expertise. I thought a lot about this question, and one of the things about, I'll talk about it from a climate perspective because of my experience, but I think it applies across the public sector because it is about social good, and when there is an issue, you really need to have all walks of life at the table. And that's really where you find some really, really creative solutions. I think that where private sector comes in, so the example beyond the cultural analogies, which I think that from a private sector perspective, you really don't see the kind of the cultural diversity and the benefit of that cultural diversity until you get into the public sector. But beyond that, I guess what I mean is that, when you're looking at innovation, and particularly for the climate crisis, which is such an urgent mandate, the best place for innovation is the crossroads between academia and practitioner. And oftentimes in the public sector, a lot of the inner workings really has to do with if we do this, then this may happen. This, this is the anticipated impact. And it isn't necessarily a proven track because you're solving a world problem, right? And so reverse engineering something like that is not a small feat. And so oftentimes it's very theoretical of this was, this regulation influenced, this behavior, but then you multiply it by 10,000 fold in terms of all the influences that have since impacted that behavior. And so bringing in the private sector experience, I think that's where the practitioner side of things come into play, of saying, well, actually, if you do this, this is how private sector is going to behave. And I say that in terms of where we are, because I have to hark back into the multi-trillion-dollar problem. Governments can't do it alone. There's just not enough money across the public sector to finance this. But where private sector comes in is that wall of cash waiting to be invested. And so that's where, having that influence and having the different angles, different perspectives at the table really makes a difference in terms of that innovation.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It kind of brings to the next question quite nicely, actually, Hong, in that, to flip it around, I suppose, what maybe do you see the private sector would benefit from looking towards the development sector, the public sector, for potential candidates, for potential people to be sitting around that table as well? Because I suppose from where we are here, I suppose we're based in Europe, and there's lots of regulation coming in that affects the private sector, that it's maybe having them to look beyond their traditional sectors for people with skills that are in like ESG, for example, and so forth. So, as I say, to flip it, what do you think then the private sector might benefit from if they were to look to the public sector for potential candidates?
It's a great question, and this was probably the hardest question, but I think you gave me a really good tip of think about all the people who I've worked with and who would I want to continue working with, even if, should I ever go back into the private sector. And there's a couple of things. I think with the growing movement towards ESG, and from a corporate perspective, and then in addition to seeking profit. So there's two sides to this. So I'll talk about it in terms of from a corporate perspective and then from a profit-taking perspective. I guess from the corporate perspective, what I have found invaluable and what I've really learned is that policy making is really a true skill, and something that from a private sector perspective you often don't see. And part of it is because profit taking does tend to be short-term thinking, and there is the long-term thinking, but oftentimes there's only a limited period of time to lose money before then anyone will call it quits in the private sector side. And so it is much more of a short-term mindset in the private sector. Whereas from public sector perspective, there really is that concept of really understanding how policy will influence long-term behaviors. And I'll put that in context of corporate change and the mentality that private sector do need to take as they embark on their ESG journey. I think that it then, you can then think about how your internal behaviors are linked up to the businesses that you provide, the profit taking that you make, but then also the regulations that then come into play. And so that's one side of the house. The other side, I think, is a little bit more obvious and touches on a little bit of what I was talking about earlier, which is if you are looking at profit taking, oftentimes that's going to be in new technologies, taking a bet, right? New technologies, new business models, going into new countries, new regions. And that can be quite expensive. And so the traditional models of looking at your internal rate of return to looking at your profit hurdles, it may not actually meet the standards. And so having someone on the public sector looking at those projects and knowing, where can I tap into concessional financing? Where can I tap into government support? And how can I influence, what we can do on the ground? I think that's where it can get really interesting as well. So a little bit of, using the technical experience and expertise of public sector to actually influence projects from the private sector.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, great. Thanks, Hong. I suppose, I don't know if you have anything else to add yourself, just any insights or anything you'd like to add in, but I suppose one final question we have from ourselves, if we can finish with that, is I suppose looking back to the recruitment process with SRI, is there any feedback you want to share that would help us improve our service, or maybe get more people from the private sector moving across into the public sector, and the other way around as well, as we spoke about? Would be great to hear from you.
Great. Now, so thank you for that, and thank you for having found me. So, it really, a year after I was confirmed from my probation, I gave SRI a call and just thanked them for what is effectively a life-changing moment for me. So thank you for that. I think that the experience with SRI at the recruitment process was excellent. But then in addition to it, just the ongoing relationship, I think, has just been excellent. One of the things, a couple of things that I thought really stood out with SRI relative to the other agencies that we use, and that I've experienced in past, the network is pretty impressive. I think that the recruiter who eventually contacted me, it was through word of mouth. And so it was through their own network of people who they knew, and that tapped right into into me. That's probably one that I continue to be impressed by. I guess the other aspect was more specifically in getting me ready for the interview process. I don't know if I believe that for public sector it is quite different than the private sector interview process. And I have never experienced the kind of interview that I had at GCF, but apparently it is quite common in public sector. And so SRI really helped prepare me for that. There was a particular training in terms of interview skills training that was provided online that I thought was incredibly helpful. Everything from the type of questions that may be asked, how to formulate responses in a coherent manner, all the way to how to sit appropriately on the chair so that you're best, you're putting your best foot forward. The background that you have on your on your video, because at the time I was interviewing during COVID, so it went from everything top to tail. So that was excellent advice and training.
Great, thanks, Hong. And when you're saying that, I'm thinking, am I sitting up straight in my chair? How does my background look? It's always there. Sometimes it's the basic things we forget about as well. So it's nice to hear, and obviously SRI always here to support as much as we can. Look, thank you, Hong, for taking the time to chat to us today and sharing your insights and experiences. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure what you're saying will touch home with a lot of people that are listening to this, who have maybe made the move from the private sector, or maybe are contemplating making that move. So really do appreciate you sharing your insights and experiences. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Noel. It's always a pleasure.